The 1980s are the end of an era for horror. After the 80s, you pretty much get suspense movies in the place of horror movies with monsters as the stars. The 80s were sort of the pinnacle of monster movies and horror movies. They were sort of going all out with special effects, and they weren't able to use CGI because that wasn't around. So they were really playing up their ability to do all these really cool things with latex and gore and all of these things. And so all the movies were really just pushing the limits of what they could do with that type of special effect. It's really hard to choose 10 movies to say are the best movies. And, you know, if I made this list in 2 months, I'd probably come up with a completely different 10 movies. Re-Animator is at number 10, and it was a film that was made right in the middle of the 80s in 1985. It was based on an H.P. Lovecraft story, so that gives it cool points. It's one of those movies that has that really weird blend of having a really morbid sense of humor along with extreme gore. So when you're watching it, you kind of have that, do I laugh or do I puke? Once you are subjected to the serum, your body parts are alive, even if they're removed from your body. One of the characters carries his head around and it is functioning independently of his body. There's just this overall feeling of them pushing everything to the limit. And I know that's common now, but at that time it's hard to describe it if you haven't seen the movie, but you're kind of watching it in this state of shock, like, oh my god, I really can't believe they did that. Pumpkinhead is probably going to be one of those where people say, huh? Why is that on the list? But I've always really loved the film. I think that it doesn't get the notoriety that it should get. Maybe the reason why is because when the film was first made, it didn't get released when it was supposed to be released. Because of some sort of licensing issue, it was held and didn't come out when it was supposed to. The film tells the story of some obnoxious kids, sort of similar to Friday the 13th. Obnoxious kids, because of their negligence, kill a younger kid, and so that younger child's parent seeks vengeance. The difference in this film is that Lance Henriksen, who is the angry father, who is seeking that vengeance, ends up feeling guilty and not wanting to follow through and killing these teenagers.
It'll pass it, Harvey. Let it finish.
No, you gotta stop it.
It's what you wanted.
No, not like this.
But by that point, he's basically sold his soul to the devil and summoned this demon that's killing these teenagers in vengeance. I always love any vengeance story because that sort of thing is just close to my heart, whether it's a horror movie or if it's, you know, it's just a regular Dirty Harry type of story. But I think that in this case, that human element, that's not just a slasher gore film, it really is played out very well with Lance Henriksen and his son, and you really do feel badly for him. You feel like, you know, I can kind of understand why he did what he did, and he's not evil. So I think that that's very unlike almost any other horror movie that I can think of. I really, really loved The Lost Boys when I was growing up. It was one of my all-time favorite movies when I was a preteen, and maybe that's because of Kiefer Sutherland being in the movie. I don't know, but I don't really have any shame about that even to this day. I still think it's a really good movie. There are things about it that obviously don't hold up well now. Joel Schumacher, it's got to be the only thing he's ever done that I like. And I say that with complete 100% hatred of his Batman movies. The idea was that they were taking the idea of Peter Pan, which the underlying story of that is a little boy who wants to stay young forever. And the idea is, well, what if he's doing that by being a vampire? So that was modified quite a bit by the end result, which happens frequently in Hollywood. But it was Joel Schumacher, ironically, that decided to make the cast be played by younger people, by putting the teenagers in. And I actually think that played out really well. It's definitely got that comedy feel to it. I think it plays out well. And when you put that along with the Once Bitten and Fright Night that also happened in the 80s, all of those films paved the way for things like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the TV show, and the film, and I'm gonna say it, Twilight. But it really, those are huge franchises, love them or hate them. Teenage kids, boys and girls, all sort of fell in love with that. I just loved the idea of vampires. I loved the idea of, the guys wearing the motorcycle jackets and riding motorcycles. They lived in a cave and had a big poster of Jim Morrison. I mean, it was just also appealing. I mean, hell, I wanted to live in the cave with them, and I wanted to be Star. She was probably the first person that I ever tried to, I didn't realize that's what I was doing, but I was trying to cosplay as her. I wanted to have her hair and her clothes, and I just wanted to be in that movie all the time. The Evil Dead is a classic 80s horror film and has to be mentioned. The whole series is just so well loved by so many people. Bruce Campbell is this huge icon now. Sam Raimi, a lot of people know him from Spider-Man fame, but horror movie fans do remember him as being the instigator of the Evil Dead films. A lot of people really love Army of Darkness the most, and then probably the next group of people love Evil Dead 2, which is a lot more comedic. Again, a lot of 80s films have that comedic edge to them. But Evil Dead, the original Evil Dead film, it was made on a shoestring budget, and it has this very creepy backwoods reading this tome of the dead made out of a human skin and, raising demons. It's got this non-stop action feeling to it. And it's very chaotic, and you just kind of feel like you're on the edge of your seat the whole time. Whereas a lot of horror movies kind of have these slow, dragging moments. Evil Dead is not like that. It certainly has a very different feeling. It has a different look with the cinematography. It wasn't anything fancy, but they did set up these trolleys or something like that, where they would pull the camera through the forest and speed up the film, and that was a look that they continued on in Evil Dead 2. But it makes you feel like you're just being whipped through on a roller coaster. Literally, you're on a roller coaster ride with the film. It's just this non-stop feeling. I mean, there are certainly problems with the film in terms of continuity and things like that. They didn't get a lot of the shots that they wanted the first time around, so they had to come back and film Bruce Campbell with a lot of extras because they couldn't get the original crew back, and you can tell from scene to scene that they're cutting back and the night sky looks different and they're having to do over the shoulder shots, but you kind of just have to love it for what it is, I would hope that my boyfriend would at least consider saving me before he chopped me into little pieces. Poltergeist is definitely important in cinema in general, certainly in the 80s. It was one of the first horror movies that I saw, and it really made an impact on me. I sat down with my mom and watched it when I was in about the first grade, and I was sleeping with my mom for quite some time after that. It changed forever the way I looked at my closet. I didn't realize that it was a Steven Spielberg movie, and It's technically not a Steven Spielberg movie. There's some controversy about that. Officially, Tobe Hooper directed the film. Steven Spielberg was directing E.T. at that time. The question is, was he shadow directing Poltergeist and just using Tobe Hooper's name in name only and sort of having him there just as a placeholder? But you do kind of get a little bit of the feeling of Tobe Hooper. He came off of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre a few years prior, and it's certainly not as graphic as that, but it does definitely have a very chilling, not Steven Spielberg feeling to it. So maybe it was a collaborative effort.
They're here.
By all accounts, they used real skeletons in the filming of the swimming pool scene, and some people have attributed that to some of the ill fates that occurred to a lot of the cast members. The little blonde girl, Heather O'Rourke, died a few years after the filming of the original movie, and not too long after the wrap of the first movie, Dominique Dunne, the eldest of the children in the family, was murdered by her boyfriend. It's not scary by my standards today. I mean, I've seen so many horror movies that it's not something that I'm going to watch and have nightmares, but it certainly made an impact on my life. Even Stephen King, the king of horror, made a note that Clive Barker was the next king of horror. And he was really the big up-and-coming horror author of that time. So when he was not only going to be writing but directing this film, it was a big deal. This presented a really interesting change. This movie is not the wisecracking Freddy or the random slayings of Jason. Pinhead is more akin to Dracula.
Oh, no tears, please. It's a waste of good suffering.
And I know that seems like a weird analogy, but he is very intelligent, very well-spoken, and he has an agenda. Freddy has an agenda, but he kind of goes about it in this wisecracking way, whereas Pinhead is sinister, and he carries himself, even though he's dressed in S&M garb, he carries himself in that way, you know, where he's commanding that authority and, you know, almost like a vampire. The other interesting thing about Hellraiser is that it doesn't have any sense of comedy about it. You know, a lot of the other movies in the 80s were going with that sense of comedy, whether it was the extreme comedy of something like Fright Night or just the punning of Freddy to sort of make the audience feel a little more at ease, or just to draw in a broader audience so that it wasn't quite as niche. But Hellraiser, just maybe it was because it was British and it could sort of do its own thing, but it really just went straight out. It was almost more like in the 70s when you had straight up horror movies that were serious. This is horror and we're not playing around. Day of the Dead is a really important film in the 80s, just in general, in my opinion, not even just in the horror genre. What would humanity do in a situation like that, where you are locked in this bunker with a very random cross-section of people, probably not the best people, in a very dire situation, and you may be the last people on Earth? And what would people do? How would people react? And to me, that's a really, really interesting question. And the answer to that, in the 80s anyway, shows where we were in the 80s. Like, it's like a time capsule of where we were in our thinking at that time. George Romero has said that he thinks it's the best movie in the series. Now, for a long time, a lot of people really, really dogged out the movie and said that it was not a good film, that it was the weakest one in the series, and a lot of people still think that. The entire movie is dark. I mean, there isn't one ray of sunshine, and that's no pun intended, because they're underground, it's a bunker, it's just depressing all the way through. It's bleak, there's no hope. You feel confined when you're watching the movie. And so I feel like Romero did an amazing job at capturing that feeling, because, I mean, you start to feel claustrophobic when you're watching it. Is it day? Is it night? You don't know. They kind of escape. They get to a place of, like, an island where they can potentially start anew. I just really like the idea of considering what would people do in that situation, and sort of forcing yourself to think about that. It's a lot more of a challenge than holing up in a shopping mall and playing house for a month or a couple weeks. Child's Play is an important film in the 80s horror genre because it's a great middle ground between the 70s and the 90s. And the reason I say that is because in the 70s you had a lot of evil little kid movies. You had The Omen and The Exorcist, and then in the 90s you move more into serial killers and that sort of thing. So Chucky kind of represents those two things coming together. Because he is a serial killer, you can kind of have him wisecracking and doing all of the things that Freddy does, but he has that cherubic face of a little kid that does slowly start to morph because of the nature of how the doll works and how the curse works, the voodoo. He starts to morph into this actual serial killer that he is. The series was blamed for inciting violence in children. There were a couple of instances where kids had killed other kids after having seen the movie, and it's kind of reminiscent of a kid killing himself after he listened to an Ozzy Osbourne album and that sort of thing. So parents groups in the 80s, I don't know if they were just all hopped up on something and they were looking to blame video games or heavy metal music or horror movies, but at any rate, they blamed, I think it was Child's Play 3 in particular, for a couple of kids killing a younger kid in Britain. So the series, yes, it's violent, and yes, it is a child's toy that is perpetrating that violence. So that's kind of warped, I'll grant you. But the series is not rated PG. I remember going to see Bride of Chucky and seeing a mother and 3 very small children going to see this film. Now, the movie to me is farcical, but I would never bring a 5-year-old to see Bride of Chucky. So, if you're letting your kids watch a movie like that, I don't really know what to tell you. No top 10 list would be complete without including Friday the 13th. Friday the 13th is not my favorite of the horror films of the 80s. I'm probably not going to win a lot of fans by saying that, but the first film in that series is actually, in my opinion, a very good movie, but it's completely unlike all of the ones that succeeded it. The reason that it's a good movie is the reason that all of the other films in the series are not good movies. Because the first film has this really cool plot that's a vengeance plot where the mother, spoiler alert, the mother is the killer who is killing all of these teenagers because they didn't watch her son and he drowned. The guy who wrote the original film wouldn't even have anything to do with the subsequent films because, you know, Jason is supposed to be the victim, not the villain. But as a jumping off point, I mean, you kind of can't deny that the Friday the 13th series, I mean, God, it spawned, 12 movies and, you know, a comic book series, a TV series, and et cetera, et cetera. So it's a powerful concept, and I mean, how many little boys dressed up as Jason for Halloween? I saw Nightmare on Elm Street when I was about 11 or 12 years old. A friend and I had rented the movie, and it was late at night, and we were watching it by ourselves. and it's scared the living crap out of us. Ever since then, I fell in love with the idea of the movie, because there's just no way you can escape going to sleep. I mean, you can escape the idea of a killer in the woods, or, you know, any of these other scenarios that you can come up with. You can not have a doll in your house, or you can, you know, not go into the ocean, or you can, all of these other scenarios. But how do you not go to sleep?
Everyone has a bad dream once in a while. It's no biggie.
Yeah, next time you have one, just tell yourself that's all it is, right where you're having it, you know? Once you do that, you wake right up.
The idea that you could die in your sleep was just terrifying. Wes Craven got the idea from people who had actually died in their sleep from absolute terror. So, you know, now as an adult you find out, well, that's something that could actually happen. So maybe not from Freddy, but that is something that is a real, you know, possibility. The thing about Nightmare on Elm Street that for me makes it the most superior of all of the films of the 80s is that each kill is really specific to the person. You know, he finds the thing that really gets you, and he makes that the most terrifying thing that it can possibly be, so that it basically scares you to death. You're thinking, well, what would it be for me? And how would he get me? For me, I don't know about you, but it's been 15 years since I've seen some of these movies, and it's really great to be able to watch them again.